Andrea Bocelli is one of the greatest tenor voices of the modern era, who has sold over 90 million records worldwide and left a profound mark on both the opera world and popular music. His album Romanza became one of the best-selling albums of all time, while his duet Time to Say Goodbye with Sarah Brightman became a global phenomenon, topping the charts in many countries, and considered one of the classic songs of world music. He has performed before heads of state, popes, and at iconic events such as the Olympics and the World Cup, and has received multiple nominations at the Grammy Awards and Latin Grammy Awards, along with being honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. In addition, he has collaborated with a host of top artists like Celine Dion, Ed Sheeran, and many other big names, bringing classical music closer to the general public and becoming a global symbol of the intersection between academic art and popular emotion. But behind all that spotlight is a life shaped by darkness from a very young age. When he was born, he already had an eye condition, and by the time he was 12 years old, after an accident, he lost his sight completely, a moment when the world did not just fade, but vanished forever. It forced him to learn how to live all over again in a reality without images, where everything existed only through sound and feeling. He could not see his parents' faces, could not see the audience standing up to applaud him, could not see the bright stage lights. Yet right in that darkness he built his own world with willpower and discipline. He learned musical instruments, studied law, worked like an ordinary person to survive, and sang as a way to keep himself from being swallowed by silence. He did not overcome the darkness by defeating it, but learned to live with it, turning it into the foundation for his music. And that is exactly what made his voice not just sound, but the voice of resilience of a man without light who still chose to become light for others. Before we step into the journey behind that voice, please hit subscribe and leave a heart. That is how you honor a man who has lived his whole life in darkness, but still brought light to millions of people. If this story touches you, please stay with us, because behind the spotlight of Andrea Bocelli is a truth you will never forget. But Andrea Bocelli's story did not begin on glittering stages or in halls echoing with applause. It began in a small room in the quiet countryside of Italy, where even before he let out his first cry, his fate had already been placed before a cruel question mark. He was born with a serious congenital eye disease, a condition that doctors at the time could not guarantee would have a normal future. And in a moment so cold it was hard to imagine, they gave a piece of advice that would break any mother's heart, that perhaps it would be better to give up this child before he had to live a life full of suffering. It was not just a medical diagnosis, but a sentence passed on a life that had not yet begun, a piece of advice that denied the entire future of a human being. But that woman, his mother, did not choose the easier path. She chose to keep the child, not because she knew for sure the future would be beautiful, but because she believed that even an imperfect life deserved to be lived. And that decision, seemingly small, was the starting point of a journey that the whole world would later come to know. But at that time there was no glory, no clear hope, only a child growing up in the fragility of his vision and an anxiety that no one could completely erase. Andrea did not see the world like other children. Images for him were always blurry, unclear, as if everything was covered by a layer of mist he could not see through. Each passing day carried a silent fear that one day even those faint images would disappear completely. And that fear was not loud, not explosive. It smoldered in every moment, in every time he tried to recognize the faces of his loved ones, in every step he had to take more carefully than other children. His childhood was not just games and laughter, but also the invisible limits he always had to face. The looks of others, sometimes curiosity, sometimes pity, sometimes questions he himself did not know how to answer. Why he was different, why his world was not like theirs. And that difference gradually created a gap. Not a gap in space, but a gap in perception, in isolation, where even with people around him, he still could not fully belong. But in that very blurry space, something else began to appear. Not through images, but through sound. Music entered his life not as a choice, but as a salvation. When everything else became uncertain, sound was still there, clear, vivid, unclouded, undistorted. Each note, each melody became something he could grasp, could trust, could feel completely without needing eyes. And gradually, music was not just something he heard, but something he used to understand the world. While others saw light through their eyes, he felt it through sound, through the way a melody could open up a space, through the way a voice could carry emotion without needing an image to go with it. And right in those moments, when he sang, when he listened, when he let music lead the way, the fear seemed to step back, not disappearing, but no longer occupying his whole mind. It was not a great victory, not an immediate change, but a small shift, a thin ray of hope in a world still full of uncertainty. And perhaps it was from those days, from an incomplete childhood, from the limits he could not choose, that something quietly took shape, a quiet strength. Not loud, not showy, but strong enough to keep him moving forward, even when the road ahead was one he could never see clearly. And then, what the little boy had silently feared throughout his final years of childhood finally happened, not gradually, not like a long process to allow time to adapt, but suddenly, coldly, and without allowing any turning back. In a soccer game just like any other kid's, a seemingly ordinary collision became the moment that changed Andrea Bocelli's entire life. The injury occurred, and then the darkness was no longer a distant worry, it became reality. There were no more blurry images, no more broken lines, no more light to hold on to, only an endless void he could not escape. That moment was not loud. There was no dramatic collapse, but inside a child, everything shattered completely. From a world that had already been fragile, it now vanished entirely. And the scariest part was not the loss of sight itself, but the too quick shift that left the mind unable to understand what was happening. Everything became unfamiliar. Even himself became a stranger. The days that followed were not acceptance, but prolonged panic, unanswered questions, the feeling of being pushed into a place with no exit, where every step carried fear, and every movement had to be relearned from the beginning. In that world, the boy did not only lose his vision, he also lost the remaining sense of safety he once had. There was no way to orient himself anymore, no way to know what lay ahead, and the greatest fear slowly emerged. Not the darkness, but the fear of being left behind, while everyone around him continued to live, continued to grow, continued to see, while he stood still in a world that had stopped completely. That feeling could not be described in words. It was like being separated from the flow of life, as if he still existed but no longer belonged here anymore. And in those days and months, his family became the only thread keeping him from falling completely into that endless void. His father's voice, his mother's presence, the small but patient gestures, all became anchors he could hold on to when there was nothing else. They could not give the light back to him, but they could be there. They could talk to him. They could help him understand that he still belonged to this world, even though that world was no longer the same as before. And in that bond, fragile as it was, not enough to erase the pain but enough to keep him from collapsing completely, the truth was still always there, unavoidable. Every morning when he woke up was another confrontation with the same darkness, with no change, no sign of hope, only the repetition of a reality he was forced to accept. And in that repetition, a question began to form, not in words, but in feeling. If he could not see the world, then how could he continue to live in it? How could he find another way to understand, to feel, to not be swallowed by the silence? And it was right then that music, which had once appeared as a small comfort in the years before, began to become something bigger, deeper, more necessary, because while everything else disappeared, sound was still there, clear, present, not dimmed by the darkness. Each note was not just sound, but an anchor, a way to orient himself, a way to know he was still connected to the outside world. When he listened, he was no longer completely lost. When he sang, he was no longer completely trapped inside himself. Music did not make him see again, but it gave him another way to exist, another way to understand that life continued, even if not in the way he once knew. And from there, little by little, it was not recovery, but adaptation, not defeating the darkness, but learning to walk in it without being swallowed. A slow, painful, but necessary process, because in that world without light, he still had to find a reason to keep moving forward, even though he could not see where that road led. And from that moment, Andrea Bocelli's life was no longer about recovering what had been lost, but about learning to exist in a completely new reality, where everything familiar had to be rebuilt from the beginning, step by step, every smallest detail. He started with Braille, those tiny dots that at first were only strange symbols. No images, no sound, just surfaces his hands had to learn to feel. It was not reading like a normal person, but a slow process that demanded almost absolute patience. Each line of text was explored with his fingertips. Each word had to be remembered through touch instead of sight. And in the early days, it did not bring liberation, but only highlighted the difference between him and the world around him even more. While other children opened books and saw instantly, he had to pause, to search, to relearn how to understand everything from a completely different starting point. And that created a sense of isolation no one could reach, because no one around him truly experienced it the same way. No one could fully understand what it meant to live without images. Conversations, laughter, all still happened, but there was always an invisible gap, as if he was standing at the edge of a world he could not fully step into. And in that gap, he was forced to find another way to connect, not through sight, but through what remained. And that was when music became irreplaceable, not just as a comfort, but as a tool to rebuild the world. He began learning piano, not only to play music, but to understand the structure of sound, to feel space through each key. Each note became a marker, a way to position emotion. Then came guitar, then other instruments, not because he needed more, but because he was trying to expand his world in the only way left. And gradually, while others relied on their eyes to understand their surroundings, he began to rely on his ears, on the way sound echoed in space, on the way voices changed with distance, on the small details that ordinary people did not notice. That ability to perceive did not come immediately. It was formed over time, through countless trials and errors, through moments of being lost and having to find direction again. And in that process, something special began to appear. He did not just hear sound, he felt it at a deeper level, as if each melody carried shape, carried depth, carried a world that only he could see in his own way. But even when music opened a door, the isolation did not completely disappear, because no one else truly stepped into that world with him. No one felt sound the way he felt it, and sometimes that made him feel like he was living in a parallel reality, where he could create beauty, could convey emotion, but still could not fully share how he experienced it. And that inability to share deepened the loneliness, even more loneliness, that did not come from a lack of people around him, but from the fact that no one truly understood his inner world. But instead of letting that emptiness swallow him, he began to fill it with music. Each note became part of the world he was rebuilding. Each song became a way to communicate, to say things that words could not express. And gradually, music was not just something he used, but became the very way he existed. While others opened their eyes to see the world, he opened his heart to listen, to feel, to create images that did not need light. And in that world, even though there were no colors, no shapes in the usual sense, there was a depth that only those who had lost something could understand. And from there, one thing gradually became clear. He would never go back to the way he was before, but he could move forward in a completely different way. a way that did not depend on what he had lost, but on what he still had. And among those things, music was not just a part, it was everything. It was the new eyes, the new path, the only way for him to see the world, even though that world no longer had light. But even when music had become the only way for Andrea Bocelli to perceive the world, his life still did not allow him to simply follow his heart, because reality always demanded something more concrete than dreams. And in a society where stability was seen as the only anchor, he chose to study law at the University of Pisa, a decision that did not come from passion, but from the need to survive, from the desire to have a life solid enough not to become a burden. In the university lecture halls, he did not only study law, he also learned how to prove that he could live like anyone else. That not being able to see did not mean he could not build a future. Each page of documents was read in Braille. Each lesson was memorized with intense concentration. And throughout that time, he not only faced knowledge, but also faced doubtful glances, unspoken questions, and limits that others unintentionally placed on him. But he continued, not because he loved law, but because he understood that life did not always allow easy choices. And when he graduated, he became a lawyer, a title sufficient to bring stability, sufficient to prove that he could stand firm in a world not designed for people like him. But beneath that stability, something else still quietly existed, not disappearing, not weakening, but becoming clearer and clearer. That was music. During the day he worked, fulfilling the role of a lawyer with specific responsibilities and clear rules. But when night fell, he stepped into another world, where there were no rigid rules, where there was only sound and emotion. He sang at bars, not big stages, not with bright lights, just small spaces where conversations, the clinking of glasses, and everyday sounds blended into his voice. And right in those moments, he was no longer someone trying to adapt to the world, but someone who truly belonged where he stood. But that created an increasingly clear inner conflict, because he was living between two lives: a daytime life with stability and social norms, and a nighttime life with music, with emotion, with what he truly wanted to pursue. And the longer he lived in that state, the more he realized he did not fully belong anywhere. In the law office, he always felt something was missing, a void that could not be filled by safety. On the small stages of the bars, he felt he could be himself, but there was no guarantee for the future. And that contradiction became a silent but constant pressure. No one forced him to choose, but he himself knew that one day he would have to make a decision between a safe path he had worked so hard to achieve and an uncertain path where he had only one thing to rely on: his voice. And that choice was not simple, because he was not only choosing for himself, but also for the life ahead, for stability, for the ability to survive, for whether he could continue to stand firm if things did not go as expected. But as time passed, music increasingly refused to let him turn away. Each time he raised his voice to sing, he felt more clearly that this was not a hobby, not a secondary choice, but an inseparable part of who he was. Something that, if abandoned, he would no longer be himself. And gradually, the fragile balance between the two worlds began to tilt to one side, not because he wanted to take risks, but because he had no other way. Because there are things in life that cannot be extinguished by reason. And for Andrea Bocelli, music was exactly that, a thing that had begun from darkness, grown in loneliness, and now was becoming the strongest force shaping the path he would take, even though he still could not see where it led. And then, in the years still torn between two paths that seemed impossible to reconcile, Andrea Bocelli's life began to turn in a direction he himself had never dared to believe was real. An opportunity appeared, not loudly, not showily, but enough to change the entire trajectory of his life, when he was invited to record a demo for the song Miserere by Zucchero, a recording originally intended only to be sent to Luciano Pavarotti for reference. And in that seemingly small step, Something no one expected happened. Pavarotti, one of the greatest tenor voices in the world, listened to that recording and was completely captivated. He not only recognized Bocelli's talent, but also affirmed that no other demo was needed, because that voice was already enough to stand on any stage. And from a man singing in small bars, from a man trying to keep balance between two lives, Andrea Bocelli was suddenly pulled into a completely different world, where music was no longer a part of life, but became the center of it. Opportunities began to appear, step by step, performance invitations, recording sessions. Doors that had never opened before now slowly revealed themselves. But what made this journey special was not the speed of success, but the way he experienced it. Because while others stepped onto the stage and saw the lights, saw thousands of faces watching them, he stepped out into a completely different world. Without images, without light, only sound, the sound of footsteps, the microphone, the audience rising like a wave he could not see but could only feel. And that created a gap that no one around him truly noticed, because to the audience, he was the center of the stage, the man under the lights, the symbol of music. But for him, the experience was not like they imagined. There was no brilliance that others saw, no moment of light shining directly into his eyes, no image of thousands of people applauding. All he had was sound and emotion. And sometimes that very difference made success feel alien even when he stood at its peak. Because external success did not change the internal reality. He still could not see, still lived in darkness, still had to rely on other senses to navigate. And even though the world around him began to call his name as a special talent, as a phenomenon, as a rare voice, in his own world he was still the person trying to understand his place in all of it, still the person walking without images to guide him. And that created a profound separation, a gap between what others saw and what he truly experienced. Because when people talked about the spotlight, about fame, about recognition, they usually associated it with images, with light, with what could be seen. But for Bocelli, all of that existed in a different way, a way no one could fully understand unless they had lived in darkness. And therefore, even when the door to professional music had opened, even when he had stepped into a world that before had only been a distant dream, his journey did not become any easier. It only became different, more complex, deeper, because he not only had to prove his talent, but also had to continue facing the reality that there were things in life that could not be changed, could not be overcome, only accepted and lived with. And it was in that acceptance, in not letting the darkness define his limits, that he gradually found his own way to stand firm on stage, not through sight, but through feeling, not by seeing the audience, but by sensing them through every reaction, every breath, every moment of silence before the applause rang out. And gradually the gap between external success and internal experience was no longer a barrier, but became part of the story itself, a part that created depth in his voice. Because each note he sang was not only sound, but also truth. A truth born from living in a world where light did not exist, but emotion was always present, clear and impossible to hide. And perhaps that was exactly what made Andrea Bocelli's voice not only heard, but also felt, as if every song carried a part of the journey he had walked, a journey that did not begin from light and had never truly reached it. And then, from those first cautious steps, Andrea Bocelli's life entered a phase where everything seemed to go far beyond any limits he had ever imagined. His songs began to spread beyond the borders of Italy, overcoming language barriers, reaching places he himself had never set foot in. And when Conte Partiro and then the version Time to Say Goodbye with Sarah Brightman rang out, the world did not just listen, but stopped. It was no longer just a song, but became a phenomenon, a melody in which millions of people found themselves. And in a short period of time, the name Andrea Bocelli was no longer unfamiliar, but became a global symbol. He stepped onto the biggest stages, performed in packed concert halls, at international events where tens of thousands, even millions of audiences followed every note he sang. The thunderous applause, the cheers, the tears of the audience all created an image that any artist would dream of. But for him, all of that existed in a completely different way, because while the whole world saw him, he could not see them. He did not see the emotional eyes, did not see the hands raised in the air, did not see the bright lights shining down on him. All he had was sound, the waves of emotion transmitted through applause, through the sudden silence when a note touched the deepest place in people's hearts. And that created a special connection, a connection not based on images, but based entirely on feeling. He did not see the audience, but he could hear them, not just with his ears, but with a sensitivity that had been formed through many years of living in darkness. He could sense when the hall fell silent, when a melody hit exactly where it needed to, when a song was not only heard, but felt. And in those moments, he no longer felt completely separated, because even though he could not see, he was still connected, still present in the same emotional space with people whose faces he had never seen. But even when that connection existed, a gap was always there, not disappearing, not fillable, because there were things that sound could not completely replace, moments that others shared with each other through glances, through smiles, through images he could never experience. And that absence sometimes made success feel quieter, because when the lights went out, when the stage became empty, when the applause gradually died down, he returned to a world without a clear transition, without images to preserve the memories of the moments that had just happened, only the sound that had passed and the emotion that remained. And in moments like that, his presence in the world became both clear and distant. He was present in the hearts of millions of people, but he could not see his own place in that world. He was loved and admired, but his experience of that love and admiration always traveled a different path. A path without images, only sound and feeling. And that made his life an existence between two states, between being the center of light and living in darkness, between being seen by everyone and not being able to see anyone. And perhaps that very existence between presence and distance created the special depth in his voice, because each note he sang was not only the sound of a singer, but the voice of a person trying to connect with the world in the only way he could. A way that was imperfect, incomplete, but so truthful that others could not help but listen. And in the explosion of that fame, amid the big stages and the non-stop applause, Andrea Bocelli still continued to walk in his own darkness, carrying his voice like the only bridge between him and the world he had never been able to see. But as the stage lights grew brighter and the travels grew longer, Andrea Bocelli's personal life quietly began to change in a direction no one on stage could see. In the early years of that journey, before fame covered everything, he had a simple family life with Enrica, a woman who had been by his side when he was not yet a name known to the whole world, when music was still a forming dream, and the future carried no certain promises. They did not have bright lights or big stages, only peaceful days where music existed as a natural part of life, where laughter, simple meals, and each other's presence were enough to create a sense of completeness. During that time, Bocelli was not a symbol. He was just a man trying to build a life, a husband, a father. And perhaps because of that simplicity, their relationship had a solid foundation, not based on fame or success, but on small and truthful things. But then, when his career began to explode, when performance invitations came in waves, when music was no longer just a part, but became the center of his life, everything began to shift in a way no one could stop. The performance schedule stretched long, continuous trips from one country to another, nights of shows following one after another, and time, which had once been the foundation of the family, gradually became rare. Shared dinners became fewer, conversations became shorter, and presence, the thing that had once bound them, began to be replaced by distance. It was not an immediate breakdown, There were no big arguments, no explosive moments, but a silent, slow but continuous drifting apart, like two people gradually floating away from each other without realizing it until the gap had become too large to close. Enrica stayed with everyday life, with family responsibilities, with concrete, intangible things, while Bocelli lived in a different world, a world of stages, of music, of travels without a clear stopping point. And between those two worlds, the connection began to fade. Phone calls were no longer enough to fill the emptiness. Words no longer carried the same emotion as before, and gradually silence began to take over the spaces between them. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of things left unsaid, of emotions not shared, of distances no one knew when they had started. And perhaps the most painful thing was not that they no longer loved each other, but that they could no longer reach each other as before, when each began to live in their own rhythm, their own world. And even though they still existed in the same relationship, they were no longer truly walking together anymore. And over time, that silence did not disappear. It only became more familiar, like a part of life that both gradually accepted, until there was nothing left to hold on to. And finally, after many years of trying to maintain a connection that had become fragile, they reached the decision to divorce, not like a sudden ending, but like an unavoidable consequence of a long process where two people who had once been very close had gradually become strangers. And in that moment, there was no victory, no one right or wrong, only a simple but heavy truth that sometimes even love is not enough to keep two people together when life pulls them in different directions. And for Bocelli, that was not only the end of a marriage, but also another loss, another void in his life that he could not see, but could not see, but could definitely feel. A void that could not be filled by music, even though music had once saved him from so many things before. After the marriage ended, Andrea Bocelli's life did not stop, but it changed in a way that no stage could reflect and no lights could soothe. Because what was lost was not something that could be measured by fame or achievements, but a part of the connection that had once existed so naturally in his life. The days that followed continued to pass with performances, travels, and non-stop invitations. Everything on the outside seemed to remain intact, even greater and stronger, but inside, a void began to become clear. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, slipping into every moment, especially when the shows ended, when the applause gradually died down and he left the stage. There was no longer music to guide him, no longer the presence of thousands of people around him, only a prolonged silence remained. And in those quiet spaces, the feeling of absence became clearest. He returned to hotel rooms, unfamiliar rooms with no traces of memories, no familiar sounds of a family, no presence of people who had once been part of his daily life. And in a world where he already had no images, that absence became even deeper, because there were no visual details to hold on to, nothing to evoke a sense of familiarity. Everything was just space, unfamiliar sounds, and a stillness that carried no emotion. And on nights like that, time seemed to pass more slowly, each minute stretching longer than usual, not because there was too much to think about, but because there were too many voids to face. And in those voids, a truth gradually became undeniable, that success, no matter how great, could not fill what had been lost. The thunderous applause could not replace the presence of someone beside him. Words of praise could not bring the feeling of belonging. And even though he could stand before millions of people, he still had to face moments when he was alone, with no audience, no lights, no sound, only silence and himself. And in those moments, music once again became the only anchor, not as a path to success, but as a way to keep his mind from being pulled into that endless void. He sang, not always on stage, but sometimes just for himself, as a way to maintain balance, to keep his emotions from drifting too far. Because when music rang out, he was no longer completely lost. When a melody appeared, he could hold on to it. could feel something concrete in a world where too many things had become vague. But even when music brought temporary stability, it could not erase the loneliness, because there were emotions that could not be replaced by any melody, voids that sound could only touch the surface of, not fill completely. And what made that loneliness special was not that it existed, but that almost no one saw it. To the world, Bocelli was still a symbol, a great voice, a person who brought emotion to millions of people. No one saw the nights he returned in silence. No one saw the voids he had to face, because those things did not appear on stage, did not lie in the music, were not spoken in the performances. And because of that, his loneliness was not loud, not visible, but existed like an underground current, silent but persistent, accompanying him through every stretch of the road, through every show, through every moment that the external light could not reach the inner world. And in that journey he did not stop, did not leave music, did not abandon the path he had chosen, but he continued to walk with a clearer awareness that there were things in life that could not be filled, only carried, and learned to live with them in a way that they did not completely break him. And then, when life seemed to have grown used to those voids, when loneliness was no longer something new but had become a familiar part of each passing day, a change began to appear in Andrea Bocelli's life, not loudly, not suddenly, but gently, like the way a new melody slips into the silences. He met Veronica at a time when he was no longer searching for anything grand, no longer expecting perfect stories, but only hoping to maintain balance in a life that had gone through too many changes. And because of that, their relationship did not begin with an explosion of emotions, but with understanding, with two people seeing in each other things that did not need to be spoken. Veronica did not enter his life as someone to replace the past, nor as part of the spotlight he was carrying. She came to him as a calm presence, without judgment, without haste, and that made him feel something he had not felt for a long time: safety. But even when that connection began to form, he did not step into it easily. What he had been through made him more cautious, not because he no longer believed in love, but because he understood that connection could not be built on emotion alone. He had once had a family, had once had complete moments, and had also witnessed it gradually drift away over time. And that memory did not disappear. It became part of how he viewed every relationship, making him unable to rush, unable to place full trust right from the start. And in that caution, their relationship developed at a different rhythm, slower, deeper, not swept up in temporary emotions, but built step by step, through small moments, through conversations, through time spent together without any need for show. Veronica not only accepted who he was, but also understood the world he lived in, a world without images, a world where feeling replaced sight, and that created a connection he had once thought would be hard to find again. Gradually, doubt was replaced by trust, not through a sudden change, but through a process where each small experience helped rebuild a feeling he had lost, the feeling of being able to rely on someone, without fear of being pulled away from himself. And over time, the love between them did not become loud or brilliant, but stable and enduring, like a current that did not need to prove its existence through grand moments, but through continuous presence, through being there every day, without leaving, without disappearing. And that very stability brought him something success could not bring: an anchor in his personal life, a place where he did not need to be an artist, did not need to stand before thousands of people, but only needed to be himself. And in that space, he no longer had to face silence in the old way, no longer had those long empty nights after the lights went out. Because now there was someone there, not to fill every void, but to walk through them with him. And perhaps in that simplicity, in not trying to change the past, not trying to erase what had happened, but simply building something new from what remained, Andrea Bocelli gradually found balance again. Not a perfection, not a life without shortcomings, but a state where he could continue to walk without feeling he was carrying too many unresolved things. And in that journey, love did not appear like a miracle, but like a process of relearning how to trust, how to stay, and how to accept that even after losses, life could still open other doors, not like before, but enough to keep going. And right in the calmer space that the new life brought, Andrea Bocelli gradually rediscovered a role that he had once unintentionally let slip from his grasp, that of a father, not on stage, not in the spotlight, but in very ordinary moments where there was no audience, no applause, only family and connections that did not need fame to exist. He had his children, people he loved deeply, but also people he had to learn to connect with in a completely different way, because he could not see their faces, could not see their smiles, could not recognize the change in their eyes according to their emotions. There were no visual signals that most people relied on to understand one another, and that created a gap that, if not addressed, could become an insurmountable barrier. But Bocelli did not let that happen. He learned to be a father in his own way. A way not based on images, but on sound, on voices, on the small details that others might overlook. He recognized his children's emotions through the way they called Dad, through the rhythm in their speech, through the pauses that, if listened to carefully, allowed him to understand more than what eyes could see. And in that listening, a special connection was formed. Not an ordinary connection, but a deeper bond, where emotions were not hidden behind images but transmitted directly through sound, through presence. And that made the relationship between him and his children carry a different color, no less strong, but different. And sometimes that very difference created a depth that not everyone had. However, alongside that bond, there still existed a silent pain, a realization he could not avoid, that there were moments he would never experience. He could not see his children growing up, could not see the changes on their faces, could not store the images that others could keep in their memories. And that was not always easy to accept, because being a father was not only about loving, but also about witnessing, about seeing the journey of his children from their first steps to adulthood, and the inability to do that created a void that no way could completely fill. But instead of letting that void make him step back, he chose to move forward in the ways he could. He spent more time, listened more, was present more in ways he had not been able to before. He tried to make up for the lost time, not with grand gestures, but with consistency, with being there when needed, with not letting the distance repeat as before. And gradually, family became an anchor he could rely on, not as a place to escape, but as a place to return to, a place where he did not need to prove anything, did not need to become a symbol, but only needed to be a father, a man, an ordinary person with very real emotions. And in that space, even though the darkness was still there, even though he still could not see, he no longer felt like he was walking alone, because now he was not only connecting with the world through music, but also through the relationships he had learned to cherish. And perhaps, in that role of being a father, he found a different kind of light. Not the light that eyes could see, but the light of connection, of affection, of things that existed beyond the limits of sight. And that light helped him continue to stand firm, not as an artist on stage, but as a human being in life. And as the years passed, when everything around Andrea Bocelli seemed to change, when his career developed, when family gradually became a more solid anchor, there was one thing that remained completely unchanged, did not fade, did not ease with time. The reality that he still lived in complete darkness, with no recovery of his vision, no miracle happening to bring the light back, no moment when he woke up and realized the world had become clearer, and that very lack of change was the hardest thing to accept. Because if pain came and then passed, people could learn to forget. But when it existed forever, when every day repeated the same limitation, the same reality then continuing to live was no longer about overcoming, but about learning to coexist. And that did not happen in a single moment. Was not a simple decision, but a long process stretched over many years. Through the times he had to face things he could not change, through the moments he realized that no matter how much success he achieved, how many stages he stood on, how much admiration he received, certain limits were still there, not erased, not blurred by the spotlight. Success did not give him the ability to see, did not help him experience the world the way most people experienced it, and that forced him to confront a deeper truth, that the value of life did not lie in having everything, but in accepting what he could not have. And in that acceptance, a different kind of strength began to form, not loud, not showy, but quiet and persistent. He no longer fought against the darkness as before, no longer saw it as something that needed to be overcome, but gradually saw it as part of himself, an inseparable part, a part that had shaped the way he perceived the world, the way he connected with others, the way he created music. And when that shift in perception happened, the darkness was no longer something completely opposed to life, but became the foundation for the way he existed. That did not mean the pain disappeared, did not mean he no longer felt the absence, but only meant that he no longer let it take over his entire being. And from that, a kind of serenity began to appear. Not serenity that came from everything becoming easy, but from having lived long enough with the difficulties to understand that they would not go away, and therefore the only way was to learn to walk with them, day by day, step by step, without needing to be fast, without needing to be perfect, just to continue. And in that process, he not only adapted to the darkness, but also found a way to live a fulfilling life in that very reality. He still performed, still created, still connected with millions of people, not despite the darkness, but together with it. And that created a paradox that not everyone recognized. That a person without light in the physical sense could bring emotional light to so many others. And that very paradox made his journey deeper, because it was not a story of triumphing over circumstances, but a story of accepting them and still continuing to live meaningfully. And when looking back, not with his eyes, but with experience, he no longer asked why this had happened to him, but focused on what he had done with it, and perhaps in that change, in no longer trying to search for something that could not happen, but accepting what he had. Andrea Bocelli had built his own kind of peace. Not perfect, not like what others understood as peace, but enough for him to continue walking, enough for him to continue singing, and enough for him not to be swallowed by the darkness, even though it had never left. And as he moved through the long years of adaptation, acceptance, and continued existence in a world without light, Andrea Bocelli's current life no longer carried the frantic pace of before, no longer a chain of continuous travels and stages following one after another without stopping, but gradually shifted to a quieter, more intentional state in his homeland of Italy, where the hills of Tuscany stretched out in a calm he could not see, but could feel through the space, through the air, through the familiar sounds of a slower life. Family became the center of everything. No longer a part pushed to the background as in the past, but a solid anchor he actively cherished. Mornings did not begin with a packed schedule, but with simple moments, conversations, everyday sounds that might have been overlooked before. And right in that simplicity, he found a kind of balance he had never truly had before. He no longer chased every opportunity that appeared, no longer needed to prove anything to the world, but chose carefully the places he would go and the performances he felt truly meaningful, not because of their scale, but because of the emotion. His career still continued, but in a selective way, where each time standing on stage was no longer a step forward in fame, but a continuation of the journey, a way to maintain the connection with music without losing balance in life. And besides that, he spent more time on activities not related to stage lights, charitable projects, efforts to support the community, especially people in similar situations, people living with limitations that society sometimes did not fully understand. For him, that was not an obligation but a natural part of the journey, because he understood the feeling of having to live in a world not designed for oneself, and he wanted to create opportunities so that others would not have to go through it alone. But what made his life special was not in what he did, but in how he did it. Throughout all the years of achieving success, he still maintained the rare humility, not considering himself the center of everything, not letting fame define his own value. He did not need to appear often to be remembered, did not need to speak much to be listened to, and that very simplicity created a different image. A person not swept up in what was glamorous but keeping his own rhythm. A discipline not only in music, but in the way of living, in the way he took care of himself, in the way he maintained small but stable habits. And that discipline helped him continue to stand firm, not because he did not encounter difficulties, but because he had learned not to let those difficulties break the structure of his life. And as everything gradually became clearer over time, he no longer focused on short-term things, no longer got swept up in temporary successes, but directed himself toward long-term values, things that could exist even when the stage lights went out. That was family, music, relationships built through real presence. And in that journey, he did not seek perfection, did not try to turn his life into a story without flaws, but accepted that those very limitations, those things that could not be changed, had shaped the person he was today. And perhaps that was why Andrea Bocelli's current life was no longer a journey chasing after something but a state where he could pause, listen, and continue walking with a serenity built over many years, not from having everything but from clearly understanding what he had and what he would never have, yet still choosing to live fully with both. And when looking back at the entire journey that had been traveled, even if not with his eyes, but with experiences accumulated through the years, Andrea Bocelli's life appeared as a story built entirely in a world without vision, a life that from very early on had no chance to experience things that most people took for granted, no colors, no images, no moments preserved through sight. And that was not just a small detail in life, but a foundation that shaped his entire way of existing, his way of feeling, his way of understanding the world around him. While others grew up with memories tied to images, to the faces of loved ones, to familiar scenes, his memories were made from sound, from voices, from melodies, from vibrations that did not need light to exist. And because of that, music was not just a part of his life, but became the main means for him to perceive the world, the only way for him to see the things that others saw with their eyes. Each song was not only a work, but a space, an image created in the mind, where he could step into it, could feel it, could live in it, in his own way. And while the outside world continued to operate according to familiar rules, he built a parallel world where sound replaced light, where emotion replaced images. And right in that world, he found a kind of freedom that not everyone recognized. But that did not mean the limitations disappeared, because there were things in life that could not be changed, could not be fully compensated. He could not see the faces of the people he loved, could not witness the small moments that others could naturally preserve, could not experience the world the way most people experienced it. And those limitations were not always easy to accept. They existed, were present, and sometimes became clearer in the moments when he realized he was missing things that others considered normal. But what made his journey different was not that he did not have those limitations, but in the way he lived with them, not letting them become stopping points, but turning them into part of the path, part of the way he built his life. And right in those special conditions, he had achieved accomplishments that not everyone could reach, not by completely overcoming the difficulties, but by learning to exist with them without letting them stop him from moving forward. He did not need to see the audience to touch them, did not need to see the lights to create brilliant moments, because what he brought was not in images, but in emotion, in the depth of experience he had accumulated through a life unlike most others. And that very difference created a way of viewing life unlike anyone else's. While others relied on what they saw to understand the world, he relied on what he felt. While others judged life through clear images, He judged it through subtle vibrations, through things that could not be seen but could be felt deeply. And perhaps that was why there was always something very different in his music, a depth that did not come from technique, but from experience, from living in a world where everything had to be rebuilt from the beginning, not based on what was already there, but on what he could create from within. And when, looking back, even without vision, he had built a journey that few could imagine, a journey that did not start from advantage, was not guided by easy things, but was made from persistence, from adaptation, from not giving up even when there was no clear road ahead. And in that journey, music was not only a means but the foundation, the eyes, the way he shaped his own world. A world without light, but not lacking meaning. Because in that world he not only existed, but also created things that made the whole world listen, even though he had never seen them. And as that journey reached its final stages, when time was no longer something infinite but became clearer in every step, Andrea Bocelli's life appeared not as a perfect story, not as a journey where every difficulty was overcome and every wound was healed, but as a life that carried voids that would never be filled, limitations that would never disappear. And right in that imperfection, his story became more truthful than anything else, because the success he achieved did not come without its price. Every stage he stood on, every round of applause he received, came with trade-offs that not everyone could see. Those were the periods away from family, the relationships that could not be kept as before, the moments he could not share with the people he loved in the way he wished. Those were the long nights that the spotlight could not follow, the silences that only he faced. And even though the world looked at him as a symbol of success, of rising up, of light, inside he was still a human being living with things that could not be changed. His blindness had never disappeared, had never improved. There was no day when he woke up and realized the world had become clearer. There was no moment when light returned to compensate for what had been lost. And that very lack of change made his journey not a story of complete victory, but a story of continuation, of walking every day in the same reality without letting it become a reason to stop. He still continued to perform, still stood on the big stages, still brought his voice to millions of people. Not because he had no other choice, but because that was the way he existed, the way he connected with the world he could not see. And in every time he stepped onto the stage, his image carried a special meaning, a man standing under lights he could not see, facing thousands of people he could not look at, but still raising his voice with everything he had, without lacking, without excess, not limited by what he had lost. And right in that image, one thing became clearer than ever, that light did not always come from the eyes, and darkness was not always the end, because there were people who, even without light in the physical sense, could still create light in their own way. And Andrea Bocelli was one of those people. He did not defeat the darkness by erasing it, but by living with it, by not letting it define his limits, by continuing to move forward even without images to guide him. And in that journey, he did not become a perfect version of anyone, but became himself, a human being with shortcomings, with limitations, with losses, but also with a strength large enough not to be completely broken by those things. And perhaps that was exactly what made his story touch so many people, not because he had no difficulties, but because he did not stop in front of them, not because he had everything, but because he continued to walk even when he did not have the things others considered necessary. And when looking back, not with the eyes but with feeling, Andrea Bocelli's life was not a story about finding light, but a story about creating it, day by day, step by step, note by note, in a world he had never seen, but still chose to believe it was worth continuing to sing, continuing to live, and continuing to move forward. The story of Andrea Bocelli does not make people heartbroken because of an explosive tragedy, but because of a pain that stretches throughout an entire life, a silent pain that never disappears. And that is what truly makes listeners fall silent. From the moment he lost his sight completely after the accident at 12 years old, when the world no longer faded, but vanished forever, to the years he had to relearn how to live with Braille, with sound, with feeling instead of sight. All of it shows a person who had no chance to choose his starting point, but still persistently rebuilt his life from almost nothing. What makes the story even more poignant is the constant contrast between the external light and the internal darkness. When he stood before millions of audiences, received applause, and was honored as a global symbol, but could not see any face among them. When he could sing to heal others but had to return to silent hotel rooms after the divorce from Enrica, where there were no images, no presence of family, and only the void that music could not completely fill. Even in the role of a father, he could not see his children's smiles and had to feel love through voices, through sound, through details that ordinary people could easily overlook. And those specific details show that success has never been a complete answer to life. The biggest lesson this story brings, especially to the people of the United States, where success is often measured by achievements and fame, is the understanding that the value of a person does not lie in what they achieve, but in the way they face the things they cannot change. Bocelli did not defeat the darkness by removing it, but by living with it, turning it into the foundation for his music, for his family, for the way he continued to walk forward. And that is what deserves the highest honor, not because he is a legend, but because he is an imperfect human being who has never stopped. If the story of Andrea Bocelli makes you fall silent, please hit subscribe and leave a heart to help spread the light he has created from his own darkness. Thank you for accompanying us until the end, and see you in the next video, where stories like this continue to touch the deepest things within us.